and was about to destroy the peaceful Venetian idyll. Byron's exile in Europe had seen him fluctuate between depression and excitement about his freedom away from the constraints of London. In Venice he had found love and rest in its liberated atmosphere. However, his relationship with Teresa had drawn him into a dangerous world of politics, and his idyll was about to be ruined.
They were forced to flee to Pisa because the Austrian police were on their trail. And the Austrian police regarded Byron with great suspicion, really. He was always suspected of being about to set off some enormous Italian revolution, which of course he never did. And by this time I think Byron had no particular wish to do this in Italy.
Instead, Byron was looking further afield to explore his political ambitions. In Pisa, he met up again with Shelley, whom he had left in Switzerland, and the reunited friends fired up each other's passions.
While they were living in Pisa, both Shelley and Byron separately commissioned boats. Byron's boat was quite a grand affair called the Bolivar, with several masts and cabins and so on. Shelley's boat was a much smaller, dinghy-like boat.
Although Byron had thrown himself into the boat-building enterprise, his life in Pisa was far from content. He had tired of his relationship with Teresa and was plagued by his ex-lover, Claire Claremont. After their separation, Claire had given birth to his daughter Allegra, but he had spitefully parted the girl from her mother.
Byron sent his little illegitimate, as he called poor Allegra, to a convent near Ravenna when she was just barely 4 years old, where she died. Horrible, horrible story. Her mother was not even allowed to visit her in the convent. Byron could be very vengeful, and particularly with women, when their pleas, demands frightened him, it brought out the most savage kind of recriminatory behavior. He would do anything to separate himself from an importunate woman.
Although he'd shown little interest in Allegra, Byron was horrified by her death. But it was not an end to the tragedy that now seemed to surround his days in Italy. Whilst testing his boat, Shelley had been caught in a storm off the Italian coast. His ship was wrecked and Shelley drowned, his body washed up on the beach.
Shelley's death was a sort of blow upon a bruise, and there was these very dramatic scenes where Shelley's body had to be burnt on the beach because the authorities wouldn't allow his body to be moved in the normal way because of hygiene reasons, and they had this almost pagan ceremony. The whole affair made Byron even more dissatisfied with his life in Italy, and probably led to his re-involvement with the Greek cause.
Shelley's death only strengthened Byron's desire to fight for a cause. In 1823, aged 34, Byron finally left Italy for Greece.
The great change, as far as Byron was concerned, in Greece, was that he was confronted with a Greece enslaved by Islam. The Greek cause kind of caught up with him, that he who had sung the whole business of the need to set free Greece was approached himself to become one of the instruments of setting Greece free, and he couldn't turn it down. He wanted to become something other than a poet.
Byron also was wooed by the Greeks who were most active in the liberation from Turkish rule for money that by that time he had a great deal of. He had come into an inheritance, and he was earning decent royalties, and he gave over an enormous part of his fortune, I think it was over £30,000 cumulatively, to the Greek cause for independence.
As soon as Byron arrived in Greece, he threw himself into the centre of the action, but he was not impressed by what he saw.
He found himself raising troops and trying to train this ragtag group of mercenaries, for the most part, in Missolonghi, the pest hole of the universe. And at that point, it was swamp-ridden with malarial fevers in the rainy season.
Byron became increasingly fed up with the disorganization of the Greeks. He was also frustrated by the appalling weather which restricted him to the army barracks. Against local advice, he went out for a ride and caught a fever. After a few days, his condition seemed to worsen, and he died on the 19th of April, 1824, aged 36.
In its actuality, Byron's death was a non-heroic, miserable one, filled with disillusion and sorrow and regret. In the most horrible and primitive circumstances, he was really killed by the doctors who bled him to death.
Byron's death in many ways captures this contradiction, which is a characteristic of his life and his work. He dies for a great cause, but in a very ignoble way. He doesn't die on the battlefield.
Although he didn't die fighting, his actions had a profound effect on the Greek cause.
Because he was such an enormously powerful international figure by this time, it made it possible for Greece to rise, to bring other people into the struggle. And he was, in fact, the kind of catalyst, I think, for the liberation of Greece, which would enormously have pleased him.
Byron had hoped to be buried on Greek soil, but his friends and family decided that his body should be brought home to England.
When he dies, there's a huge outburst of public sympathy for his death. When his funeral procession passes through London, lining the streets of London are hundreds of ordinary people weeping, really genuinely moved that he's died. He's a great champion of the ordinary reader, the ordinary man. He's perceived as their champion because he stood up for the rights of workers in the House of Lords, because he wrote a poetry which was deliciously irreverent of norms and conventions.
Whilst Byron's death was greeted with huge sympathy from the common people, he was still reviled by his noble contemporaries.
It was customary for the nobility to attend the funerals of one of their own, but in Byron's case, he was still in disgrace, and they sent their carriages empty. It was a kind of empty, hollow gesture, a mark of propriety, and yet a lack of sincerity.
Loved and hated in equal measure, Byron had proved to be mad, bad, and dangerous to himself, but he'd become a legend as the ultimate romantic hero.